Imagine a soldier. He's a young man, barely out of his teens, who has seen the absolute worst of humanity. He has fought his way across Europe, through France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. He has witnessed battle, seen friends fall, and liberated towns from a brutal enemy. In every town he entered, he was met with a wave of pure joy. People would flood the streets, waving flags, singing, and offering kisses and wine. It was a celebration of life, a release of pent-up hope. It was the morning of May 5, 1945. The war was all but over. As his unit rolled into a small town in the western Netherlands, he expected the same scene. He was ready for the cheering, the smiles, the relief. Instead, an eerie silence hung in the air, broken only by the rumble of their vehicles. The people who emerged from their homes weren't celebrating. They weren't even really walking. They were shuffling, a slow, painful procession of ghosts. Have you ever seen a person so broken that they've forgotten how to hope? That's what these people looked like. The elderly seemed ancient, their bodies contorted by an unseen weight. Adults leaned on each other, as if the simple act of standing was a monumental effort. They were everywhere, yet they were barely there at all. They looked like little spirits, their faces skeletal, with eyes that were huge and hollow in their sockets. One little girl, maybe 7 years old, stood by the side of the road. Her dress, once bright and colorful, now hung on her like a sack, altered again and again to fit a frame that just kept shrinking. Her legs were like twigs, lost in a pair of wooden clogs that were probably the only shoes she had. When the soldier's vehicle stopped, she took a hesitant step forward. She didn't smile, she didn't wave. She just stared at the soldiers with a look that was a terrible mix of desperate hope and the deep caution of someone who had learned that kindness was a dangerous thing to expect. She just stood there, swaying, too weak to do anything more. What would you do? In that moment, the soldier did the only thing that felt right. He reached into his pack, pulled out a simple chocolate bar, a treasure beyond imagination, knelt and held it out to her. For a second, she just stared, as if she couldn't comprehend what it was. Then her hand shot out and grabbed it, clutching it to her chest as if it were the most precious jewel in the world. And then the tears came, streaming down her hollow cheeks. In a voice that was barely a whisper, she said, "Thank you," over and over again. "Thank you, thank you."
Behind her, more children were appearing, 20, then 30, then 40 of them. All of them were skeletal. All of them stared with that same haunted look of disbelief and fragile hope. The soldiers, hardened combat veterans, looked at each other, the shock clear on their faces. They had seen death, but this was something else. This was the slow, cruel erosion of life. The order came quietly, but with absolute authority. Break out all the rations, everything we've got. These kids are starving to death. What followed was a beautiful kind of chaos. Soldiers who moments before were warriors became saviors, handing out every scrap of food they had. Children cried as they held chocolate, crackers, and canned meat. Their parents fell to their knees, not with the energy of celebration, but with the collapsing weight of overwhelming gratitude. For these people, liberation wasn't about a flag or a political victory. It was about food. It was about the sudden, miraculous return of a hope they thought had died forever. It was about knowing their children might just live to see tomorrow. This was not a natural disaster. The famine that ravaged the Western Netherlands from September of 1944 to May of 1945 was a man-made catastrophe. It was a deliberate policy of cruelty, a punishment inflicted by the German occupiers on the Dutch people for daring to support the Allies. The numbers tell a story of systematic atrocity. Think about it. Roughly 4.5 million civilians were affected. Somewhere between 18,000 and 22,000 people died directly from starvation. Among them were an estimated 2,500 to 3,000 children. When liberation finally came, Around 200,000 children were suffering from severe malnutrition. By February of 1945, the daily calorie intake for an adult had plummeted to between 400 and 800 calories. To put that in perspective, a toddler needs more than that to survive. For weeks at a time, food distribution stopped completely. By January, there was no fuel for heating. People were left to freeze in the dark, with nothing to eat. How did it come to this? It began in September of 1944. The Dutch government in exile, based in London, called for a national railway strike to disrupt German movements and support the Allied Market Garden offensive. The strike was an act of brave resistance, but the retaliation was swift and merciless. The German authorities imposed a complete food embargo on the western part of the country, the most densely populated region. The timing could not have been worse. The embargo began just as winter was setting in, the time when a nation would rely on its harvest stockpiles. With the railways paralyzed and German forces blocking all road transport, the region became an isolated island. The food that was there was consumed within weeks, and there was no way to get more. The German authorities ignored all pleas for help. Appeals to international humanitarian organizations were blocked. This wasn't an accident of war, it was a weapon. The message was clear: this is the price of resistance. The descent into starvation was not immediate. It was a slow, creeping horror that unfolded over months. At first, in September and October of 1944, rations were tightened, but people managed. Families ate through their own stored food, holding on to the hope that the embargo would end soon. Life maintained a fragile sense of normality. But then came November and December. Rations dropped below what a person needs to survive. The desperation began. Families started burning their furniture just to stay warm. Gardens were stripped bare of anything remotely edible. People killed and ate their pets. The first deaths from starvation were reported, mostly among the elderly and the sick. From January to March of 1945, the situation became a full-blown catastrophe. Ration distribution became a distant memory, ceasing entirely for weeks on end. Can you imagine the choices people had to make? Families resorted to boiling tulip bulbs. They are toxic, but they provided a few calories. Sugar beets, normally fed to livestock, became a precious commodity. The death toll began to rise dramatically. April was the peak of the suffering. Spring was technically approaching, but there were no food reserves left. The death rates were at their highest. Parents had to watch their children literally waste away, powerless to do anything. Mass graves were dug for the victims. Entire communities were on the brink of collapse. The psychological toll was unimaginable. In countless diaries and letters from the time, parents wrote about the agony of hearing their children cry for food they didn't have. They described watching their sons and daughters grow weaker and weaker each day. They faced impossible choices, like how to divide a single moldy potato among several hungry children. The despair was absolute. One mother wrote in her diary in March of 1945, "Today, my youngest asked for bread. I had none." She cried, then stopped, because she's too weak to cry for long. She is 7 years old and weighs perhaps 30 pounds. I watch her dying and can do nothing. If the Americans don't come soon, she won't survive. None of them will. Children carried the heaviest burden of the hunger winter. Their growing bodies need nutrition, and there was simply none to be had. Doctors who lived through the period documented the horrifying effects of severe malnutrition. The progression was cruelly predictable. First came the weight loss. Then the body would start to consume its own muscles. Edema would set in, causing the body to swell grotesquely due to a lack of protein. Finally, the organs would begin to fail. The children's bodies were eating themselves to stay alive. Their immune systems collapsed, making them vulnerable to diseases that would normally be trivial. Schools, for those who could even attend, became showcases of this horror. Teachers reported children fainting from hunger during lessons. Some were too weak to even make the walk to school. Others would fall asleep at their desks, their bodies trying to conserve every last bit of energy. The few teachers who had any food would share tiny morsels with the children who looked closest to death. One pediatrician in Rotterdam described seeing children with conditions he had only ever read about in textbooks on famine in the developing world. He saw children of 10 years old who weighed the same as a healthy 5-year-old. Some, he noted, were already past the point of no return. Their organs were too damaged. All he could do was try to make them comfortable as they died. The psychological damage was just as profound. Chronic hunger became their entire world. They became listless, withdrawn, unable to play or laugh. Some became obsessed with food, talking endlessly about meals they remembered from before the war. Others stopped talking about food altogether because the subject was just too painful. They were children who had forgotten how to be children. Meanwhile, the Allied forces were pushing toward Germany. Their commanders knew about the humanitarian crisis unfolding in the Netherlands. Intelligence reports, messages from the Dutch resistance, and accounts from refugees painted a grim picture. But they faced a terrible strategic dilemma. The Western Netherlands was not directly on the path to Berlin. The German forces there were contained and not a major military threat. Diverting troops and resources to liberate the area would slow down the final push into Germany, potentially prolonging the war and costing more lives on the battlefield. So, what was the right thing to do? Pursue the fastest possible military victory while knowing that civilians were starving? Or divert precious resources for a humanitarian mission while the war raged on? It was a deeply uncomfortable calculation. The initial decision was to prioritize the military advance. The Netherlands would be liberated later. But they couldn't just do nothing. As a temporary measure, the Allies organized airdrops of food. In the final days of April 1945, after negotiating a fragile truce with the local German commanders, Operation Manna and Operation Chowhound began. Royal Air Force and U.S. Army Air Force bombers, the same planes that had been dropping bombs on German cities, now flew missions of mercy, dropping crates of food over designated zones. For the people on the ground, it was a miracle. Food literally fell from the sky. But it wasn't enough. The drops were sporadic, and the supplies only reached a fraction of the people who needed them. Distribution was chaotic, and for the children who were already on the verge of death, they needed immediate, sustained, and specialized nutrition. The airdrops were a lifeline, but they couldn't solve the crisis. Only full liberation could do that.
When Allied ground forces finally entered the Western Netherlands in early May, they found a situation that was even worse than the reports had suggested. The statistics about death and malnutrition were one thing, but the reality on the ground was a visceral shock. The soldiers encountered people who were desperate for liberation, but were too physically weak to celebrate it. The classic scenes of joyous crowds were replaced by something much more subdued, yet infinitely more powerful. People emerged slowly from their homes, and when they saw that the soldiers had food and were distributing it immediately, they simply broke down. Grown men wept openly. Women collapsed in gratitude. The mission changed in an instant. Combat units became humanitarian organizations on a massive scale. The immediate priority was to feed everyone as quickly as possible. Every available food supply was distributed. Field kitchens were set up to prepare hot meals around the clock. Medics moved through the crowds, identifying the most severely malnourished for urgent care. For the American soldiers, this work became one of the most meaningful experiences of the entire war. They had fought and won battles, but feeding a starving child felt more significant than any combat victory. This went beyond just following orders. They gave away their own personal supplies. They shared their rations. They spent their off-duty hours trying to bring a sense of normality back to the Dutch children, playing games with them and just being a friendly presence.
One soldier wrote home to his family in Massachusetts, "We're feeding Dutch families who haven't had real food in months. The children cry when you give them chocolate, not because they're sad, but because they're so grateful they can't contain the emotion. Yesterday, a little girl gave me a flower she'd picked. It was the only thing she had to give. This is why we fought the war, so children like her could have flowers instead of starvation." Deep connections were formed. The Dutch and the Americans shared cultural similarities, and many Dutch people spoke some English. Families opened their homes to the soldiers, and the soldiers responded with food, supplies, and friendship. The children in particular followed the American soldiers everywhere, creating bonds that transcended the horrors that had just passed. The physical recovery for the children was a long and delicate process. A body that has been systematically starved can't just go back to eating normally. The reintroduction of food had to be gradual and carefully supervised. Allied medical personnel set up special clinics to treat childhood malnutrition, providing supervised feeding programs, vitamin supplements, and care for the diseases that had taken hold during the famine. But the psychological recovery was just as important. These were children who had lived with the daily terror of starvation. They needed more than just food. They needed to feel safe again. They needed stability and time to heal from the trauma. The Allies organized schools and recreation programs. American soldiers played baseball with the Dutch kids, taught them American songs, and organized games. It was more than just entertainment. It was a form of therapy, a way to help them rediscover the childhood that had been stolen from them. In the end, this story is not about military strategy. It's about the most basic human obligation, to feed a hungry child. The American soldiers who handed out their rations weren't just following orders. In many cases, they were breaking regulations about conserving military supplies. They were making a moral choice. They decided that the life of a dying child mattered more than military logistics. The Dutch civilians who cried at the sight of food weren't just celebrating a political victory. They were parents experiencing the overwhelming relief of knowing their children would live. Their tears were about life itself, a life that had been given back to them by strangers who chose to share what they had. The liberation of the Netherlands showed that a victory can be more than just defeating an enemy on the battlefield. It can be about saving a generation. It can be about creating a bond between nations that lasts for decades, a bond built on the memory of one nation saving another's children. Those skeletal children in wooden clogs grew up. They grew up healthy and strong, and they raised their own children in a world of peace and prosperity. They became living proof that compassion can triumph over cruelty, and that even in the darkest moments of war, a simple act of kindness, a chocolate bar, a can of meat, a shared ration, can change the world.